All right. So thank you everyone who did the roll call. I really appreciate it. There was a couple, some people were very specific, and I want everybody to think about, being more specific in their goals, just so that they have, attainable goals, things that you can really accomplish. For me, I got to get faster with my bike riding because I'm riding with a lot younger people now and I can't keep up. So we rode 40 miles yesterday, but so my specific goal is to continue to increase my endurance and keep up with the younger people. So that's my wild one. And now that we have this rescue puppy, well, I have a feeling I'll have a lot more walks in my days. And of course, eating healthy, that's one of really important for me. It just, I feel better. I know that my kids are better when they're eating well. And so lots of good stuff out there. And then of course, stress in this pandemic is really important to try to manage, try to find new ways to be able to be out, to enjoy what we have, but also realize that, I had a business during the pandemic that I recently sold, but it was really tough to have 14 teachers depending on me and having to back out completely. And well, we didn't actually, we built out Zoom classes for ballet, which was interesting. So I'll just give an introduction to this week's chapter. It's really,
looking at?
Did you have a question?
Oh.
Okay. And if the dog jumps up, I apologize. So the module has opened, and it's a simple one. No, I take that back. The assignment is simple, but the actual topic is pretty interesting. I'm going to stop sharing my Canvas and go into the PowerPoint. And I'm not going to, obviously it's already recorded, so I don't want to have you sit through everything, but it just kind of goes through the objectives. But the real gist of this particular chapter is one, kind of reviewing what we did first, looking at then, as we go through here, what are some of the leading risk factors as we go through? They'll be quite often tobacco use, lack of exercise, poor diet, and alcohol use. And in other words, we want to change the behaviors that we have that increase our risk to having poor health. But this chapter, and this is not the right one, sorry, I gotta go into my chapter 2. I'm probably looking straight at it and I don't see it. There we go. This one is really about how the cell functions. So it's kind of a review of where we were. But we're going to talk a lot more in this particular unit or module about the cells and what really is important in the cells. And so as we go through talking about diet or what our body needs, we really have the proteins, the carbohydrates, the lipids, and then the RNA and DNA, or the nucleotides. And as we talk about this, our cells are really comprised of these molecules. But what the focus of this particular unit is looking at these particular structures and where they come from, what's important about them. For instance, proteins. One of the most important things is that our body is making proteins from the actual sequence of the genes. And if they misfold, then it is really important to understand what happens. They no longer have the same binding. I was showing someone the little cartoon that Genentech made of some of my research, and it was really about how do cells bind? How do they recognize different things? And so the protein, the actual receptors are very important to consider. And of course, where do we get our energy? We get our energy from the carbohydrates that we ingest because we can't photosynthesize. So we have to ingest these, and our body has to break these down and break it down to a point where the cell can actually use it and turn it into what we ATP. So as you go through this, you'll think about why are each of these important to the body? For instance, the proteins. That's how we identify the cell. That's what the cell makes. That's how we communicate. The body uses lipids for its membrane, for protection around different organs, for steroids. Carbohydrates are part of our energy. And then, of course, the nucleic acids build that code within our body so that we have this code that leads to our understanding or how our body makes the proteins that it needs. It gives the sequence of the amino acids, how they're put together, and then that helps with the binding. And then it goes into, okay, so who cares? So what are the actual structures of the cell that make it function, and so that it is its own unit? And so we have what we call organelles, or these little organs, and these are made up of structures that have been designed because of the nucleotide of the nucleic acids into DNA, which is read to RNA. But these little organs each have a very specific function. And when you hear things like enzymes, those help drive a reaction. They're very specific and say at a specific pH, a specific temperature. They will drive a reaction. They will help provide that basically structure so that either molecules can separate or they can come together. And of course, the sum of all of this, and this is, I always know that there's a question on the midterm about this, or maybe one of the quizzes, but the metabolism is then how our bodies use the energy and breaks things down. And when we go farther along and we're talking about digestion and all the way from eating the food to all the way through metabolism, then we're actually looking at the overall consumption. I think my son just sneaked into the screen. And here comes the dog. Now the dog's excited that the sun's up, so this will be interesting. So the structure of the generalized cell that you're working on today in this particular unit is really about what's going on inside. And say if you go on into Bio 10, you're going to talk a lot more about how does that differ from a plant cell, and what is a cellular wall versus a cellular membrane. But I really want you to focus today or this week as you go through it on what is the membrane, what does this consist of. The nucleus, which houses the nucleolus, and the chromatin is where the DNA is housed. And as you move into, say, Bio 20, you're going to talk a lot more about what is the science behind that. How does the message actually come from the cell and get into the cytoplasm and then be made into a protein? And so that's how then the great part of Bio 20 is you go into all of that if you're interested. Then, of course, you have other structures such as the endoplasmic reticulum that helps basically where those proteins are made. So as the message comes from the nucleus and goes to the actual membrane, then the proteins are made, and then they have to be transported. They have to be packaged. And so you go through all of these different organelles to understand how you get that message, become a protein, and actually make it to the cell surface or even be transported outside the cell. And so those are the things that you're going to cover. Of course, the other one that's very important is as I always joke about it, being the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is then where that energy comes into the cell and actually is chemically changed so that it becomes ATP. So that's the cellular.
You're so dramatic. Throw them.
Question?
Aquí.
You look like a little puppy with a poppy.
Do you have a question?
What?
All right. As well, I think you have your microphone on, just so you know. But anyways, I'm going to stop you there and see if you have questions. And again, the recording is there. And if you have any trouble with the lab, I talked about it in our last lab check-in. So I'm going to stop this particular sharing. This is your slides in your module. So and then I'm going to share. Oops, I'm going to stop that share and share into the actual module. So again, module 2. So module 2 this week, I have the lecture recorded that goes specifically through each one. And again, if you have the textbook and it'll help define all of these. If you don't have the textbook, it's not hard to look these up. Honestly, the questions are specifically about the organelles, so I talk through all of them in the lecture. So you have the link to the lecture. And then I also put the link from last week's lab check-in. So it's here and it just basically walks you through how to do the lab. The lab is not complicated except that it's modified from what you actually did, or actually what it looks like in the lab manual since we're not on site. And so you can just walk through the actual module and we have the slides and then just the PDF file. And then the lab. Now oops, let's see. Okay, it looks like I'm having a little internet trouble. Some people had some trouble with the lab notebook, and so it is in here. Anyone that has trouble with the reading, I did leave that in module 1 as well as then the lab book, which is here. So this is the actual assignment in your let's see, in here. So if you didn't get the lab book, everything is here. Don't worry about it. But that reminds me, the reading, which you'll need for next week's lab, that was in the actual lab manual, the back section. This is a good one that I want to walk through maybe at the lab check-in. But I wanted to see if anyone had any trouble reading it, kind of going through it. It's really, a nice introduction. It was written by Dr. Lewis, one of our professors. Let me go to the end of it. Talks about the ions, the cells. The focus of next week's lecture is going to, or not lecture, but the lab is really about understanding type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And so just to give you an intro to it so that you don't have trouble trying to get through this reading, is that, again, type 1 versus type 2 diabetes has the same output on the cell, the same impact to the body. Basically, the sugar isn't processed in the body, so it ends up in the blood, and excess sugar in the blood basically clogs anything that's tiny, such as, in your hands, in your eyes. And so we don't want excess sugar being stuck in the blood. We want to make sure the body processes it. Well, in type 1 diabetes, basically the body is not making insulin. So the actual trigger that drives that reaction is not there. Versus type 2 is when the receptors are no longer active. And so that's one thing that when you come into this reading, if you have any trouble, we're going to spend a lot of time as we go through understanding type 1 versus type 2. Okay? So, are there any questions? Are things going well? You should be able to get through this week's okay? Good. And again, you are not required to be here. It's really cool to see everybody. I've had people in the office hours as well as lab check-ins, but make sure you don't waste time trying. If something doesn't make sense, just let me know, because I don't want this to be a major draw of your time, but more something that helps you along as we get through this class. So, okay. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful week. I will be here Wednesday morning again to answer any questions and to start the lab for the next section. But again, Monday is a holiday, so I won't be on Monday. However, all of your homework assignments are extended, a day. So I will see you Wednesday, or have a wonderful extended weekend. Bye, everyone.